Good day, ladies and gentlemen. The fanfic is something that is rather maligned these days. It is looked upon with derision, with people saying that it's 95% crap. In all reality, commercial literature is, of course, 95% crap. What's really funny is that some fanfic actually becomes commercial literature. 50 Shades of Grey was once supposed to be a Twilight fanfic. In all reality, there are numerous excellent fan fictions out there, with many of them rivaling or surpassing commercial literature. The fans generally will do, at times, better than the original creators could do. Today, we're taking a look at what is by far my favorite fanfic of all time, XSGCOM Generallotz Defense. The fanfic series in its totality is referred to as XSGCOM Mirror Image. Now, a bit of background on both franchises. Stargate is a franchise that started out as a film that was pretty good, and then it was followed up by a TV show called Stargate SG1. Now, the TV show is somewhat different from the movie, and this fanfic follows the TV show and its characters. Stargate SG1 followed a cast of characters headed up by Colonel O'Neill. You then had Captain, then Major, then finally Colonel Samantha Carter, Daniel Jackson, who would actually leave the show in Season 6 and be replaced by Jonas Quinn, who was a decent character, if a bit generic here and there. And last, but certainly not least, you had the Worf equivalent, Tilk. In a page straight out of Star Trek, they explored strange new worlds, encountered new civilizations, and boldly went where no one went before. Except in this show, they also tried to not die, because the villains were the Goa'uld, a bunch of insane symbiotic organisms that wanted to take over the universe, or at the very least the galaxy. Now, this was done for about 7 seasons. Then they ended up defeating the Goa'uld, and then they had to face the Ori, which were basically just your typical generic supervillains that really were not developed all that well, and they were okay, but nowhere near as interesting as the Goa'uld. And some of the characters were changed around as well. Richard Dean Anderson, who played Colonel O'Neill, left the show because he was getting on in years and wanted to spend more time with his family. He was, of course, replaced by the guy who played the main character in Farscape. And also, one of the other Farscape alumni, Claudia Black, showed up as well as a major character. Ultimately, the last 3 seasons of Stargate SG1 were okay. They weren't amazing, but they certainly weren't terrible. XCOM was a video game franchise from the early 1990s and was an RTS series, and one that I did not play back in those days, mainly because I was more of a first-person shooter fan. XCOM UFO Defense was the very first game in the franchise, and had the evil sectoids invading the Earth and trying to take it over. In the game, you had to create numerous bases, and you had to defend the Earth from UFOs. It was a very difficult RTS, one that is legendary amongst the RTS community. So what do you get when you combine Stargate SG1 and XCOM? You get nothing short of awesome. One of the big issues with Stargate SG1 was the fact that they never used any of the technology they discovered. Eventually they'd get a couple of spaceships, but they didn't actually use some of the more important technology, such as the sarcophagus. What's the sarcophagus? Well, it's this device that if you lay in it, it will actually bring you back to life if you die. They didn't use that primarily due to storytelling and budgetary reasons. In the novel, they actually use it all the time, and it makes sense. Now, SGXCOM UFO Defense more or less is just the same as the first 7 seasons of the television show, just with different events taking place. So instead of having, say, Daniel Jackson die due to radiation poisoning, he chooses to die because in SGXCOM they have access to human-made sarcophaguses. Overall, when it comes to this particular fanfic, the writer does not actually make Stargate look terrible or XCOM look good, or make XCOM look terrible and make Stargate look good. He fully integrates both into one universe and shows respect to both franchises and both franchises' characters. When the fanfic starts up, we are introduced to the awesomeness of XCOM. They go through the Stargate to a Goa'uld-held world. Now, the XCOM troopers don't actually show up. Instead, the Mega Malp is introduced. For those who do not know, the Malp was this robotic device that was sent through the Stargate to make sure that it had a compatible atmosphere and gravity and things of that nature. In this one, well, they've got plasma chain guns and energy shields on it. And ultimately, it goes through the gate and immediately vaporizes a whole bunch of Jaffa. Who are the Jaffa, you might ask? Well, they're the Goa'uld ground troops. They generally are armed with a really, really crappy weapon known as the staff weapon, but we'll get to that later. The Jaffa primarily all die, and one is left alive, and a new character named Commander Sharp gloats at him, which is actually quite entertaining. Then we cut back to Stargate Command in Cheyenne Mountain, and we learned that XCOM is indeed taking over Stargate Command, sadly. General Hammond is going to administer the base alongside Commander Sharp, head of XCOM. Commander Sharp is not altogether that generic and is fairly nuanced. He's basically your Clint Eastwood style character that doesn't take no crap from anyone and generally does what he wants. Now, there's some characters in the fanfic that will call him a fascist, even though he doesn't really act that way. Now, keep in mind, this was written before the current political climate, so they're not just calling him a fascist just because. There's some new rules that Commander Sharp is bringing, one of which is that there's going to be a new member on SG1. Now, in the TV show, Colonel O'Neill never wanted anyone on SG1 other than the people that he actually liked. In this fanfic, he has to accept a Russian sergeant, who is actually female and is supposed to be extremely attractive, and is supposed to be one of the greatest shots in the world. And she's there primarily to keep an eye on Tilk, because you have to remember, XCOM doesn't like aliens because their war is much more difficult than the war that SG1 is fighting against the Goa'uld. XCOM in this universe is still fighting the sectoids, but it's a little different this time. In this universe, XCOM is fighting sectoids created by an Asgard named Loki. Who are the Asgard, you might ask? Well, the Asgard are an alien race from Stargate SG1. They were actually allied with the humans, but there was one rogue Asgard named Loki, who only showed up in one episode of the TV show. And that episode was generally a lighthearted romp, actually. It's actually rather funny that Loki is used as this really horrible villain that abducts and vivisects humans, whereas in the show, he was a guy who kidnapped Colonel O'Neill and then created a young clone. The whole episode was just one of those de-aged episodes. And it's rather amusing to see Loki go from just kind of a bumbling villain to literally Space Mingala. Ultimately, Stargate SG1 adapts to these new rules and goes on their various missions. And it's really quite cool to read about these missions because it is so close to the TV show that you actually feel like you're reading the show and getting more information all the time. Pretty much the entire fanfic is just the TV show, but with a few minor details changed as mentioned earlier. Throughout the show, a lot of characters show up and are promptly forgotten, and a lot of situations that happen in the show that were kind of dumb are fixed. For example, a Goa'uld was trying to masquerade as a member of the Jaffa Rebellion. In this fanfic, he's easily found out because XCOM has access to this thing that actually can read people's minds. And so they're like, well, we just need to scan you. He starts running, and yeah, it's pretty easy to figure out that he's the villain. The staff weapon is actually improved and handed out to the Jaffa. In fact, what's kind of funny is they figure out, oh, maybe if we put a stock on there and some sights, you could actually hit something with it. Whatever next? And it basically becomes the Space K-47. As alien technology is collected, more and more advanced fighter craft are designed to fight the sectoids. So one part of the fanfic actually helps the other part of the fanfic. And the XCOM stuff will also help the SG stuff. It's really quite an interesting way to do it. Now, also, old characters that are just straight up forgotten by the show are brought back. Towards the latter part of the fanfic, what you have is an invasion of Mars. They find out that Loki is making Mars his base, and so they decide to invade it. Now, what's really cool is they get the Robo SG1 team to help invade it, because they don't have to breathe, you see. Sadly, in the show, the Robo SG1s were pretty much forgotten and then brought back just to be killed off. What's also funny is Robo O'Neill actually becomes a fan of Futurama. You see, in Stargate SG1, Colonel O'Neill is made out to be a fan of The Simpsons. Well, Robo O'Neill becomes a fan of Futurama and is a big fan of Bender because he's a robot. Really quite well done all around. They never actually nerf SG1. SG1 is still pretty much seen as death incarnate, and they always kick ass. XCOM is not so amazingly competent that it just completely stomp all of the SG teams either. Ultimately, the fanfic ends in Season 7. Season 7 was the penultimate Goa'uld season where finally one of the main villains, Anubis, was defeated. But the fanfic doesn't necessarily end here, ladies and gentlemen. Oh no, for there was a follow-up called XSGCOM Terra from the Deep. This sadly was never actually finished as far as I know. This fanfic follow-up covers the Stargate Atlantis TV show up till about Season 4, if I'm not mistaken. It also adapts the XCOM game XCOM Terror from the Deep and introduces a new villain called the Aquatoids. Ultimately, this is more or less Stargate Atlantis with some new villains thrown in, and works fairly well. Unfortunately, we don't really know what ends up happening, which is quite sad all around. Overall, ladies and gentlemen, this is a must-read fanfic. One of the reasons why I love this fanfic so much is because it actually uses legitimate logic and science. One of the big problems with TV shows is, oh, we've got this super amazing technology. Next episode, it's gone. Or, oh, let's use this Hollywood tactic to fight the enemies. And somehow it works. In this, they actually use legitimate tactics and actually act more or less like real people would with this given level of technology. It's a fairly lengthy fanfic, but one that will keep you turning pages all bloody day long. You can find it on fanfic.net and spacebattles.com. I believe spacebattles.com is by far the most updated version of this fanfic, but remember, it is still not completed and likely never to be completed. Ultimately, this fanfic right here shows that not all fanfics are amateurish pieces of crap, and I cannot recommend it enough. And so, I am Generallotz, wishing you good, The Last Spartan, and good Mass Effect, End of Days, or whatever makes you happy. If you enjoyed my review of XSGCOM Mirror Image, please consider subscribing, and if you can, please consider supporting me on Patreon so that I can continue bringing you these fanfic reviews.